When you watch a really good stage illusion, there's this unspoken agreement that you're just going to be fooled. I mean, the magician waves their right hand, a flash of fire goes off, and
And you totally missed the left hand, right? Like dropping the coin into their pocket.
exactly, you completely miss it. It's essentially a structural failure of human attention. We are just biologically wired to look at the flash.
We can't help it.
Right, we can. And welcome to today's deep dive, because today is all about how that exact same illusion happens out in the real world, in our governments, our institutions, and public policies.
Yeah, it's a fascinating dynamic.
It really is. So we're unpacking this really incredible essay by Elias Kunis called Complexity Laundering. And our mission for this deep dive is to explore what he calls a structural epistemological failure in modern society.
Which sounds like a mouthful, but it's vital to understand.
Right. It's basically a breakdown in how we process reality.
Yeah.
It's this huge mismatch between the massive complexity of our systems and our, basic human ability to actually comprehend them. We want to understand how this mismatch allows actively harmful policies to look undeniably righteous to us.
Yeah, and that stage illusion metaphor you use is the perfect starting point for this. I mean, we enjoy a magic trick because we know it's a trick, right?
We paid for the ticket.
Exactly. We know there are invisible mechanics operating just outside our field of vision. But you step into the world of public policy, and we just completely forget about the left hand. We look at a policy, we see that flash of good intentions, and we just assume that what we see is the entirety of the outcome.
We just take it at face value.
Totally. We fail to see the mechanics working in the background that might actually be driving disastrous results. And when a major policy fails, what do we hear? The same excuses over and over.
Oh, like, we didn't spend enough money or whatever.
Yeah, right. We didn't spend enough, or external factors intervened, or, bad actors sabotaged the rollout.
Yeah, you never hear a politician standing up at a podium to say, hey, everyone, the structure of this policy was fundamentally designed to make its own failure completely invisible until it was too late.
Never. That just doesn't happen.
Okay, let's unpack this because the mechanics here are wild. How does a massive societal cost become invisible while a relatively small benefit stays, like highly visible? If the bad effect is hidden, where does it actually go?
Well, it gets pushed. It gets pushed out of sight, across space, across time, or down a really long chain of events. And that is the basic anatomy of complexity laundering.
So space, time, or causal chains.
Exactly. The core concept is that a policy has a highly visible, immediate good effect. We can call that effect A, but it also has an invisible, delayed, or just incredibly complicated bad effect, which is effect B.
And people just don't see effect B at all.
Because most human beings simply cannot mentally map that complex causal chain from the policy to that bad effect. Effect B basically drops out of their decision-making calculus entirely.
It just ceases to exist in their version of reality.
Right. So the policy feels purely good. And anyone opposing it looks like, well, a villain opposing a purely good thing. Kunis breaks this down into three main mechanisms. The first one is spatial laundering.
Okay, spatial laundering. This is where the cost happens somewhere else, right? To other groups or in other regions. It's the classic out of sight, out of mind.
Yep, that's exactly it.
And Kunis uses rent control
Right.
as his baseline example for this. Now, really quickly, just to be super clear to everyone listening, we're absolutely not taking a political side on rent control here.
Right. Neutrality is key. We're just looking at the mechanics.
Exactly. We're just using the author's structural example.
Yeah.
So, looking at the mechanics, the visible good of rent control is incredibly clear. You cap prices to help renters afford to live in the city. That is the flash of fire.
But the invisible cost is spatial. Developers look at those price caps and, well, they decide to build housing in a neighboring city instead.
Because the math just doesn't work for them anymore.
Right. Existing landlords might stop maintaining their buildings. Black markets form where people sublet apartments at these exorbitant unofficial rates. And the people who bear the ultimate cost are actually the newcomers.
Like young people or immigrants.
Exactly. They arrive in the city and are entirely locked out of the housing market because nothing new is being built and nobody is moving out. The costs are dispersed to people who literally aren't in the room or even in the city when the policy is being debated.
Man, it really makes me think of squeezing a water balloon.
Mm-hmm.
You wrap your hand around the middle and squeeze. You look at your hand, which is the visible benefit, and you say, look, I made the balloon smaller right here.
But you don't immediately notice that the water has just bulged out at the top and the bottom.
Yes. Spatial laundering just pushes the water to a completely different zip code.
Mm-hmm.
So what about temporal laundering? That pushes the water into the future, right?
That is the second mechanism, yeah. Temporal laundering is where the costs happen decades later. The classic example here is pension promises. The visible benefit is a politician promising that you will receive a specific, really generous amount of money when you retire. It feels like an immediate gift, a guarantee of security today.
But the invisible cost is that massive unfunded liability that's going to hit like 30 years from now.
Precisely. And figuring out if the system can actually fund that promise requires incredibly complex actuarial modeling. You're dealing with variables like future birth rates, inflation, market returns. I mean, almost no one can calculate that in their head.
Right, so the promise feels immediate, but the cost feels totally theoretical.
It's an abstraction.
And the real kicker is the timing. By the time the bill finally comes due and the system starts buckling, the politicians who made the promise, they've long since retired.
They collected their votes and exited the stage decades ago.
Wow. Which brings us to the third type, right? Causal laundering. This is when the costs are just so many steps removed that the chain of events gets completely lost.
Yeah, causal laundering really relies on the limits of human attention. Kunis uses the policy of taxing the rich more to illustrate this one.
And again, neutrality warning for the listeners. We're looking strictly at the structural model here, not taking a political stance.
Definitely. So the visible benefit is simple first-order thinking. Wealthy individuals pay more taxes, resulting in more revenue for public services. Everyone can see that step.
But the invisible cost requires seeing a dynamic system rather than a static one. You have to trace all these ripple effects.
Right. It might lead to capital flight where assets are moved offshore. It might change the incentives for entrepreneurs, which leads to reduced domestic investment.
Which means fewer jobs created.
Exactly. Which ultimately results in a reduced overall tax base a decade later. The advocate for the policy usually isn't modeling those fifth or sixth order effects. They are running a simple static equation in a wildly dynamic world.
I mean, if human cognition is optimized for these simple A causes B first-order effects, are we just biologically unequipped for modern civilization?
Honestly, it represents a profound biological mismatch. Human cognition evolved to handle problems at a tribal scale, groups of roughly 150 people where your actions have immediate, highly visible consequences.
We want simple cause and effect.
Right. We look for narratives with clear protagonists and antagonists. But modern policy operates at a civilizational scale with millions of interacting agents. It deals in delayed statistical outcomes and emergent patterns where there is no clear villain to point a finger at.
I mean, think about the last time you voted on a local ballot measure. Did you mentally map out a 15-year economic chain reaction involving changing interest rates and demographic shifts?
Of course not. Nobody has the time or the data for that.
Exactly. So if our brains naturally struggle with this, how does our primary tool for collective decision-making, democracy, handle it? Does it correct for our cognitive blind spots?
Well, according to the essay, democracy actively makes it worse. Yeah, it brings us to what Kunis calls the democratic epistemology crisis. The standard model of democracy requires voters to be highly competent, to vote based on nuanced policy outcomes rather than tribal identity, and to trace the long-term effects of policies back to the specific politicians who enacted them.
And complexity just destroys all of those conditions simultaneously.
It absolutely does.
Which leads to one of the most striking concepts in the entire piece, the laundering horizon. Kunis lays out a really hard rule here. Any policy that has a feedback loop longer than the political election cycle, which is usually about 4 years, simply cannot be managed through ongoing electoral accountability.
Because if a policy's negative effects take 10 years to materialize, the voters cannot use a 4-year election cycle to punish the person who created it. You start to see how terrifying this selection pressure is.
Yeah, it's not just that a corrupt politician can exploit these long horizon policies.
No, the system structure essentially guarantees that they will. Imagine two politicians running for office. One proposes a policy with a highly visible benefit today and a hidden catastrophic cost 20 years from now.
And the other proposes a balanced policy where the trade-offs, the costs, and the benefits are all painfully clear today.
Who wins?
The first politician will win the election almost every single time because they are handing out free water balloons without showing the bulge on the other side.
Exactly. The system actively selects for complexity laundering. If we connect this to the bigger picture, Kunis compares this dynamic to Moloch, which is a mythological term used in systems theory to describe a positive feedback loop leading toward catastrophe.
Right, Mullen.
In a Moloch dynamic, no one is actually acting out of malice. Every individual is acting rationally according to their own short-term incentives, but the overall system inexorably selects for failure. Pensions, massive debt accumulation, deferred infrastructure maintenance, these all operate comfortably beyond that 4-year laundering horizon.
Okay, hold on. Let me play devil's advocate for a second.
Go for it.
If the system is this broken and the outcomes are eventually terrible, why do voters fiercely defend these policies? When the water balloon bursts and the spatial or temporal costs finally arrive right in our own backyards, why wouldn't a rational voter just look at the data, admit the mistake, and course correct?
Well, the barrier there is tribal binding. For most of us, belonging to our social or political group is a core human need. Truth is often only valuable if it serves that sense of belonging.
Interesting.
So when you point out the laundered, invisible costs of a policy to someone who supported it, they don't process that as neutral new data. They process it as an attack on their tribe.
They hear, you are attacking the working class, or you are trying to dismantle our institutions.
Exactly. The psychological defense mechanism isn't to debate the mathematical model. The defense is to inflict social punishment for disloyalty, which leads directly into another fascinating trap Kunis identifies: morality laundering.
Yes, morality laundering is such a powerful concept. This is where the advocate gets to feel an intense moral glow from the visible intent of a policy, while being completely insulated from the moral responsibility of the invisible harm.
It's incredibly common.
Kunis uses minimum wage increases to illustrate this. And again, neutrality rules apply. We're just talking structure. The visible part is entry-level workers getting a higher hourly rate. The advocate feels intensely righteous and moral for supporting that outcome.
Because the critical mechanism here is that the moral feeling attaches entirely to the visible action, not the net outcome.
Right.
The invisible effects, like marginal workers being priced out of the market entirely, or hours being drastically cut, or businesses investing heavily in automation to replace those roles, those do not factor into the moral equation.
Because the advocate literally cannot see the complex causal chain connecting their vote to that downstream harm.
Right, they aren't being deceitful. The sheer complexity of the system hides the second-order effects behind the warm, moral feeling of the first-order intent.
You get to feel like a saint while accidentally pulling the ladder up behind you. But this raises a huge question about what happens when the damage finally becomes visible. When the system clearly breaks and the invisible costs become undeniable realities, who gets fired? Who is held accountable?
The grim reality is no one. That is accountability laundering.
No one gets fired.
Nope. Complex systems diffuse responsibility so perfectly that no single human being ever makes the bad decision. The essay highlights coalition governments as a prime example of this. Imagine 5 political parties sharing power to form a government. A major policy is implemented and it fails miserably, wasting billions. What does every single party say in the aftermath?
Oh, they all say, we wanted a better version of this, but we had to compromise with the other 4 parties. Every single leader points the finger at the collective.
Exactly. The system itself takes the blame, but you cannot fire a system. There is no personal feedback loop, no institutional learning, and no behavioral correction.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. Kunis shares this incredibly specific, memorable anecdote about a major Finnish corporation called Cone.
Oh, this story is wild.
In 2024, a senior executive was caught dead to rights manipulating summer job applications to favor a family member. It was classic, blatant nepotism. A massive internal investigation was launched, HR got involved, meetings were held, the bureaucratic machinery ground into gear. It felt like a massive consequence machine was operating. And what was the actual output of all that process?
A verbal conversation.
Just a conversation.
Just a talk.
Okay.
No formal warning, no mark on their record, no demotion. After all the investigations and committee meetings, they just went right back to work.
And Kunis pairs this story with a staggering statistic about the legal profession. The Finnish Bar Association resolved almost 600 cases in 2023. Out of those 600 investigations, they revoked exactly 2 licenses.
2.
Meanwhile, Norway, which has a very comparable population and legal structure, revokes about 24 licenses a year. That is 12 times the rate.
And Kunis points out that it is highly unlikely Finnish lawyers are somehow 12 times more ethical than Norwegian lawyers.
Yeah, probably not.
The mechanism at play is that highly procedural systems become accountability laundering machines. They simulate the feeling of justice. They have boards, hearings, appeals processes, and endless reviews that just tire people out. But they do this without ever delivering the physical reality of consequences. The procedural sophistication is actually what hides the lack of accountability.
It's just a simulation of justice. Which really begs the ultimate question. I mean, we've diagnosed the disease here. We've mapped out how the magic trick works across space, time, and bureaucracy. But how do we cure a problem where the fundamental equation is that system complexity is simply greater than our aggregate modeling capacity? Can't we just educate people?
It seems like we should be able to, right?
Yeah, I mean, if everyone listening to this deep dive right now understands the mechanics of complexity laundering, won't they just go out and demand better policies?
It is the most logical assumption we make in a democracy. But Kunis delivers a very harsh truth here. No. Raising awareness fundamentally fails to fix structural problems. In fact, he calls education campaigns and awareness drives simulated metamorphosis.
Simulated metamorphosis. That's a dense phrase, but it basically means going through the motions of changing without actually changing anything, right?
Exactly that. It means these campaigns make you feel like you did something productive without actually changing the architecture of the system. The citizen who understands complexity laundering and votes based on that understanding is still just feeding input into a system that physically cannot process signals beyond that 4-year laundering horizon.
Wow.
You are just a smarter cog in a machine that is still programmed to fail.
So feeling informed is just another psychological trap. If the core equation is that system complexity outpaces our capacity to model it, we actually have to fix the math of the system itself.
Yeah.
And the essay outlines 3 architectural fixes.
Right. First, you tackle the left side of the equation, reduce system complexity. The mechanism for this is decentralization and modularization. You make systems physically small enough that local feedback loops are rapid and visible.
Give me an example of that.
Okay, if a town of 5,000 people passes a terrible tax policy to fund road repairs and the money is wasted, the potholes appear immediately outside the mayor's house.
Right.
The citizens feel the temporal and spatial costs almost instantly, and they can vote that mayor out in months. The feedback loop fits comfortably inside human cognitive limits. A centralized nation of 300 million people cannot operate that way.
That makes total sense.
Yeah.
Okay, second, you tackle the right side. Increase modeling capacity. But you don't do this by sending everyone back to school for advanced economics degrees, right?
No, you change how decisions are aggregated. Kunis suggests using prediction markets, which aggregate distributed knowledge by forcing people to have financial skin in the game, or adopting liquid democracy.
Liquid democracy.
Yeah, in liquid democracy, you don't have to personally vote on a complex 30-year tech infrastructure bill. You can delegate your vote to an engineer you deeply trust, who has demonstrated competence in that specific field. You increase capacity by routing decisions to those who can actually model the outcomes.
Oh, I see. And the third fix might be the most crucial structural shift. You have to change the architecture of how we judge success. We have to shift the system from input legitimacy to output legitimacy. Let's define those terms because they are vital.
Absolutely.
Input legitimacy is asking, did we follow the rules to get here? Like, did we hold the right hearings, use the right voting procedures, and consult the right committees? But output legitimacy ignores the process entirely and asks one brutal question. Did we actually get the result we were promised?
Yes, and Kunis gives a brilliant example about healthcare to illustrate this shift. He argues we shouldn't ask voters to debate the intricate nuances of a complex healthcare funding model. The voters cannot possibly model whether a single-payer or multi-payer system will reduce wait times in a decade.
They just don't have the bandwidth.
Exactly. Instead, you mandate an output. The rule simply becomes, the healthcare system must provide necessary care within 14 days. If it fails to do so, the patient is automatically compensated a specific cash amount per day directly from the health department's budget.
Kunis calls this semantic deflation, which just means popping the hot air out of vague buzzwords like adequate health care or equitable access and replacing them with a hard, ungameable outcome. The voters don't need to understand how the engine works, they just need a dashboard that tells them if the car is actually moving forward.
This raises an important question, though. Who is checking that dashboard? Kunis suggests we need an entirely new architectural layer, what he calls a fourth branch of government.
A fourth branch.
Right. Its sole dedicated function would be auditing whether institutions actually produce their stated outcomes. Not checking if they filed their compliance paperwork, but auditing the physical reality of the results. He calls it a Department of Aliveness.
A Department of Aliveness. I really love that phrasing. It acts as like a constitutional protection against a system just quietly going dead while pretending through endless paperwork to be alive.
Exactly.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? It means that the next time you see a policy proposal that seems like a simple, obvious, morally pure fix, your alarm bell should be ringing. You need to look for the hidden costs. Where is the water balloon bulging? Is the cost being pushed to a different city? Is it being pushed onto your kids 30 years from now?
It also means recognizing the limits of the system you are in. Because our democratic feedback loops are largely broken beyond that 4-year horizon, sometimes your only real feedback mechanism is exit.
Voting with your feet.
Jurisdictional competition is incredibly powerful. You don't need to be able to mathematically model why a city's housing policy or a state's tax code is failing. You just need to observe the reality that it is failing and move somewhere else. Mobility provides structural feedback to the system without requiring you to be a systems theorist. It drains resources from failing architectures.
That is a highly practical takeaway. But I want to leave everyone with one final lingering thought, inspired by Kunis's essay. It's something that really forces you to look in the mirror.
You're thinking of the awareness trap.
I am. We talked about simulated metamorphosis, the idea that raising awareness is often just a pressure valve. It releases our anxiety and makes us feel righteous without changing the actual architecture of the world. So is the very act of you listening to this deep dive right now actually part of the problem?
Right. Have we all just engaged in simulated metamorphosis together? You listen to the analysis, you feel informed, you understand the mechanics of the illusion, but will this knowledge actually change the systemic architectures you demand in the real world? Or will it just make you feel slightly more intellectually superior the next time you cast a vote into a completely broken machine?
The magician still has the coin in his pocket. The trick still happened. Knowing exactly how the trapdoor works doesn't matter at all unless you're willing to actually walk onto the stage and nail it shut.